I will try and talk into the microphone, but if I wander away and you can't hear me, please just yell out and let me know. So, we'll get the relieving bit out of the way first. Even though I've placed a booklet on your seats and there's paper inside it, there is no exam at the end of this. So what I'd like to do in the next hour or so, I suppose, is just run you through what Meat Standards Australia is, how it, I suppose, fits in with the Prime Dorper Lamb initiative, and what you need to do to become MSA registered. Now, if any of you have heard anything about it, what you might have heard is that it's pretty simple. And you know what? I reckon at the end of this hour, there will be very few of you who leave here with any other opinion than that. It comes down, if you like, to a couple of really simple things, and that is feeding your animals well and treating your animals well. And you know, I don't think there's anyone in this room that wouldn't be doing that. I suppose what we do, though, is we formalise that a little bit, so that the animals, when they arrive at the abattoir, wherever that may be, they're arriving in a similar condition, so that the processors have some idea of the type of animal they can expect. So, as I said, it's I don't think anything here today will sort of rock you off your chairs too much, but I hope that what we can do is just explain the process to you, and then when someone says to you, well, what is MSA? You'll be able to answer that question with confidence, especially as, you know, as your brand moves forward, you will probably see that little MSA logo floating around there as well. So it'll be, you know, it will be important that you can explain it. So just to run you through the paperwork that you do have, the booklet is yours just to take as reference material. And I'll be, I suppose, summarising what's in that book, but I certainly won't be running through it page by page. So that might be a sigh of relief there as well. There's a couple of pieces of paper in it though. So this one here, this is the registration form. So for any of you that have got the info with you today and would like to fill that out, I can take those this afternoon and drop them back into the office and we can get them into the system. One thing I would say, down there on question 5, it asks you a question of whether or not you're an MLA member, and if you are, what your number is. I don't think there's many people that can quote their MLA number. If you don't have that info, please don't worry about it. It certainly won't stop the process or getting the form entered. And the rest of it is really just your company details, and your ABN and PIC will be important. Now the other one, this is probably as close as we get to a test. That is a little test, but that's a little test to me. So if I could ask you when we finish or at lunchtime, if you could fill that evaluation form out, that just shows them that I did actually come and do something today and didn't just drive around through the roadworks for the morning. So, look, we'll make a start. So what is MSA sheep meat? So MSA sheep meat is an eating quality scheme. What MSA isn't is a brand. So you don't ever actually go out and buy an MSA steak or an MSA chop. What you do is you buy a Prime Dorper lamb chop underpinned by the MSA eating quality system. And when we talk about eating quality, we talk about all parts of the supply chain. So from the producer to the processor, right through to the retailer and the wholesaler. And we ask everyone in that supply chain to be either registered or licensed. And whilst there's no cost, whilst there's no cost to everyone but the processor, they actually have to pay a licensing fee. Why we ask people to be licensed is just so that they know what the requirements are on them for their part of the MSA supply chain. Now, we're going to run through yours today, and I'll quickly touch on some of the requirements for the processor, just so you know what they'll be doing or expected to do with your animals. And also, excuse me, from the retail wholesale side of things, there's a bit of work that they have to do as far as aging the meat. And also when they sell it, they have to advise how that piece of meat should be cooked, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But when you hear that, you know, everyone in MSA needs to be licensed, please don't look at it as the big brother approach. The reason that we do ask that is that everyone along the supply chain just has the opportunity to get that little bit of training to know what they need to do, because it's no good you fellas doing everything that you should and then the processor or the retailer or the wholesaler letting it down, so that when it actually gets in front of the consumer, which is the important bit, that the product they're eating is not what they would expect. So I suppose just to get right into the nitty-gritty very quickly, what's in it for the producer? And at the moment, there's really a couple of things. And the main thing I would say is that if you're not MSA registered at the moment, you might just be excluding yourself from a couple of existing markets and a couple of markets that are looking to come online. There are customers out there who are asking for their suppliers to be MSA registered. So, you know, the bottom one there, I've put premiums with a question mark after it because it is a little bit questionable at the moment whether or not being MSA registered actually gets you more dollars and cents at the end of the day. There certainly are some signals that that's happening, but what it means is that, you know, probably to be part of, you know, the Prime Dorper Lamb initiative, for example, they would ask that you be MSA registered. So I think the main advantage at the moment to being registered is just not to be excluding yourself from markets by not being registered. So I think that moving forward that will be a major benefit. And look, not to tease, but I know that there is coming up another major customer coming online who will be looking for some animals from MSA registered producers. Now, I'm not purposely teasing you with that, it's just that it's all very quiet for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Just let's say that if you register today, you might just be pleased that you are registered in a few weeks' time, because I think we're going to have someone, especially in South East Queensland, that will be looking for some animals from MSA registered producers. So again, it's just about making yourself available for that market. And I think the thing will be too is that again, when we finish up here today, I think you'll see that, well, hey, I'm already doing all that. So if I just need the piece of paper, well, after today you'll have that piece of paper. Now, excuse me, as far as questions go, we had the discussion of whether or not we do them while we're doing the presentation or leave them to the end. I'm happy to take them at any time during the presentation. Just remember that you know, we've got an hour and as you've probably gathered, I tend to talk a lot. So we'll see how we go for time. So how did the MSA Sheep Meat Program come about? And it came about for one really simple reason, and that is that at MLA, what we try and do is get people to eat more red meat. And about 10 years ago, there was some work done that I suppose we surveyed people to find out why they weren't eating as much red meat as what they used to. And the main sort of response that we got back was that there was just a real lack of consistency there. You could spend a heap of money and you might get a really nice meal, but also you could spend a lot of money and have a really ordinary feed. So when we've got competitors out there, and I sort of talk about this a lot, I think one of the main enemies that we have out there, and whether it be beef or lamb or whatever, you know, we've got the barbecue chook that we're all up against. People walk into a supermarket of an afternoon and they look up and down that red meat counter and go, oh, there's so much to choose from. Actually, I don't know what I'm going to choose from there, but look over there. There it is, it smells good, it's cooked, it's in a bag, it's $12, away we go. Now, at the moment, we probably can't match the convenience of a barbecue chook, but I tell you what, we can, you know what, all over it when it comes to taste. So long as we can convince people that if they buy our product and cook it the way that we suggest, it's going to be good, and it's going to be good time after time. Now, this is the MSA logo there. Now, its job is to make sure that people keep coming back week after week and buying, you know, products like Prime Dorper Lamb. The consumer may never know what that little logo is. And, you know, I suppose it's part of my job to make sure that they do know. But if they don't know, yet they keep coming back week after week and buying the product, well, I think MSA is doing its job. So what MLA did after they got this feedback from consumers is that they got groups of consumers around a table and started doing what we call sensory testing. And basically what sensory testing is getting groups of people to eat meat that's put in front of them, cooked different ways, and get them graded on how tender it is, how juicy, how much flavour, and that fairly black and white one of overall liking, you know, did you like it or not? And based on that, we've been able to build an MSA cuts model for lamb and sheep meat. And we'll show that on the next page. And sometimes the reaction to it is, right, so you've got now about 300,000 bits of data and you've put together this A4 sheet. You fellas have done a great job. And, you know, I can completely understand that reaction. But what we have ended up with, and I'll just quickly forward through to it, that is the sheet that we provide to any of the MSA registered retailers or wholesalers. And what it allows us to do is, or what it allows them to do, is to sell every cut in the carcass with confidence to consumers based on the cook method. So, you know, one of the things we found out from the consumer research is that whilst we in the game might have a pretty fair idea of what to buy and how to cook it, unfortunately most consumers have very little idea. So they might know that lamb chops are good to grill, and you'll buy a leg of lamb if you want something to roast. Now, it comes as no surprise that when you've got that whole carcass to get rid of, you need to be able to sell every bit of that animal, or otherwise, you know, you're not going to be in business for long. Just as a bit of a side note, the problem child at the moment, as far as eating quality goes, is the top side. So, you know, it takes a fair chunk of the carcass, and at the moment, the only MSA preferred cooking style we have for it is stir fry. So that's a lot of stir fry. So there is ongoing testing being done, and when I say ongoing testing, you know, trying different cooking styles to see whether or not we can improve I suppose, the financial performance of the top side, because, you know, stir fry tends to not be your top dollar cooking style. So what we've done is provide for each of these cuts, and it's pretty much everything in the carcass, this preferred cooking method. So what I think you'll start finding is that rather than walking into your butcher shop or your supermarket and seeing, you know, the cuts actually listed with a cook method on it, I think you're probably going to start seeing the reverse. I think you're going to start walking into shops and you'll see the grilled section and the stir fry section and the roasting section, because I don't think people care or know too much even the names of some of the cuts, and, you know, some of them don't give too much away, and in fact some of them, you know, you probably, you know, leg chomp doesn't sound particularly great. So, you know, I think that you're going to see more and more people, retailers, focusing more on the cook method rather than the cut. And, you know, that can have some real advantages to it too, and especially, this is always a good time of year to be doing these presentations, because what you can have is people walking in and going, well, look, I know that I want to cook a lamb stew. So they might go in and go, well, look, I bought some of those grilling chops last week and they were great. So, you know, maybe I might buy some of those for my stew. So what they end up with is a really expensive yet ordinary stew. But if they bought something a bit cheaper that's got a little bit more connective tissue in it that can break down and make that sort of great gravy taste, well, they're probably going to end up getting a better meal for a lot less money. So yes, this is the result of 91,000 people eating different cuts of meat and giving us their opinion on it. So whilst it might not look like much, we hope that it is certainly giving the retailers confidence to get rid of, it's probably, yeah, it's a bit crude, but yeah, get rid of some products that they might have had trouble selling in the past. So this will change and evolve as time goes on, but I think, you know, the most obvious one that we're going to see moving forward is the top side. There really is a lot of focused work being done on that, because it is just such a big cut of the carcass, and at the moment to have to sell it all as top side is not ideal. Now, this chart doesn't change based on, you know, whether it be a tiny little butcher shop or whether it be Woolworths. They all work off this same chart. Now, someone like Woolworths might come to us a little more regularly and say, look, we want to sell the X cut cooked Y way. And what we have to do then is start that round of sensory testing again to see whether or not that gives the same result. So this is what you would be provided with for the Prime Dorper Land project. Now, a really important point here is that if ever you walk into a store and you see this MSA logo, that's the old MSA logo, you see the MSA logo on some product, and it hasn't got on there how that product should be cooked, that is a surefire way of knowing that that premise is not MSA licensed. So even though, and look, we don't go into them with all guns blazing and, you know, pull the product off the shelf and say you're not doing this right. What we would do though is just go into them and say, look, you know, there's a couple of things that you have to do, and one of those really important things is making sure that you show a cook method for that cut, because it's all about taking the guesswork out of it, because we just can't assume that people will know how to take that piece of meat home and cook it. And that's the crux of the consumer side of MSA. It's all about providing the correct cook method for each cut they buy. So I suppose just no more guesswork. Now, we can't guarantee, of course, that they're going to not take it home and completely stuff it up, but we've done the best that we can and certainly given them some guideline. Yes, mate?
Have you got a copy of that for us to have a look at, that chart?
Look, I can certainly leave that up there. I can show it to you on my computer. It's not something that we hand out. It is given to you once you register as a retailer normally. But look, we can certainly provide them once the registration's gone through. So as I sort of preempted, I suppose, at the beginning, that there's a couple of things that we'll talk a lot about in the next sort of half hour or so. And they all pertain to how you feed your animals and how you treat your animals. Because as far as MSA goes, we cannot do a presentation without showing the glycogen bucket. So for any of you that might have sat in on one before, you will have seen this, because this is a pretty good way of describing the importance of glycogen. Now, what glycogen is simply the energy that an animal has in it while it's living. We all have it. Every living animal does. There's one way in for glycogen, and that's through what we eat. And there's one way out for glycogen, and that's through stress. And as we know, that stress can take lots and lots of different forms, but it all sort of falls into that one category. Now, why glycogen is important is that when an animal dies, that glycogen turns to lactic acid. Now, so long as that carcass has enough lactic acid, the meat won't be dark. And that sort of brings us into, I suppose, the next really important part of MSA. We try and keep dark meat off the shelves, because unfortunately, another thing that these consumers have told us is that they just don't like the look of dark meat. Now, you can lodge a pretty convincing argument that actually dark meat might even eat a little bit better. Unfortunately, it's an argument that we don't need to have, because the consumers have said to us, we don't like dark meat, and realistically, if you want to take it that next step, we don't like yellow fat either. So one of the things that we try and do with MSA is keep that dark meat off the shelves, because it's no good at being there and hoping that someone will buy it. You know, the research is showing that people will just walk past it, or they will buy it once it's had the big red text taken to it. So, you know, it's certainly not an ideal situation. And the meat colour story, I suppose, is a bit of a good news, bad news one. The bad news is that if the meat colour's not where it will be, oftentimes that product will not be eligible for MSA. Well, not oftentimes, it won't be eligible for MSA. The good news is there's a fair bit you can do to make sure that your animals don't cut dark. And so we'll talk about some of the recommendations and requirements of MSA. They all have to do with that. Just making sure that the nutrition's where it needs to be, and that anything that can cause stress on an animal is being controlled. So just, I suppose, to go back to this, the reason that we include the MSA ice bucket there is, if you can just imagine this is your animal heading off to slaughter. We'll need our imagination caps on this morning. As we said, there's one way in for that glycogen, and that's through nutrition. Now, it probably comes as no surprise that we would say to you, make sure your animals are in the best possible condition they can be when they're heading for slaughter. Now, I'm really mindful of the fact that we just put this one little word up there, nutrition, and a little bit later on, I'll probably say too, and look, it's great if they're on at least a steady or preferably a rising plane of nutrition, especially in that last 30 days. Now, that is certainly preferable, but as we know, not always achievable. So what I would take home from this simple little word nutrition here, do the best you can. Because what you need to keep in mind is that the fuller this glycogen bucket is, the better chance you have of your animals not cutting dark. Because when they leave your place, they're probably going to go through the most stress they've ever been through in their lives. And that's not because anyone's doing anything they shouldn't, but they're just going to be on and off trucks and maybe seeing different people and different animals, and they might come across a dog that they haven't had much to do with before. So, all of those things fall into this one category. which is stress. So if you think about it, they're all going to lose a certain amount of glycogen, every single one of them, just due to that normal sort of stress that they'll go through from when they leave your place to when they get to the works to be killed. So if you think about it, if their hypothetical glycogen level is down here and they lose, they lose that amount that they're going to lose anyway, there's just not going to be much left there to turn into lactic acid. They're the type of animals that will cut dark. So, as I said, the nutrition one, we don't have any real stated guidelines as to, the type of growth they should be making. We will say a little bit later on, around that 100, 150 grams a day would be ideal in the last 30 days. But again, just really conscious of the fact that that won't always be achievable. But if you do the best you can as far as keeping that nutrition up to them and avoiding anything that might cause them stress, then your chances of them grading are really, really high. So just to talk just a little bit more about dark cutting. Dark meat is caused by high pH, and just to make it a little bit more confusing, a high pH animal is one that doesn't have enough lactic acid. So you just need to make sure lots of glycogen means lots of lactic acid and they won't cut dark. Now, if dark meat was the only sort of consequence of high pH, we wouldn't have a lot to worry about because it's not actually the dark meat colour that causes like a dip in eating quality. You won't even taste much difference. But there's another few things. So dark meat will always stay that darker colour. So if you're like me and like a little bit of the bark cooked out of it, well then you'll never get that because it will always remain red in the middle. So a lot of this product will go into food service. So what they need to know is that if they get a particular cut of meat and cook it for a particular amount of time on each side, well then it will be cooked rare or medium to well. But they need to have that certainty. They can't then put up with something that, because it's darker to start off with, they cook it the amount of time that they normally would, they send it out, and the customer sends it back. They cook it a little bit more, so of course what that's doing is just completely ruining everyone's good work. So the other part of it is that it retains a lot more moisture, so it goes off quicker. So again, that's not something that the wholesale sector would really want to put up with. And last but not least, is that it actually has such a high moisture retention rate that when you're eating it, you're kind of thinking, oh God, that's really dry and chewy. That's because it's sucking the spit out of your mouth. So, if that's not enough reason to keep it off the shelves, I often think though, we could build a marketing campaign about it, got too much spit, turn to high pH meat, there's your answer. So, that's just some of the reasons why, I suppose, to back up our claims, why we want to keep it off the shelves. The simple and most important one, though, is that consumers just don't like it. So, it really is, it all comes down to consumer preference, and of course that's who we're trying to please. So the next few things, I'm really conscious in these slides that these are the telling you how to suck eggs slides, if you like, because I don't think there's anything that we have here in these next slides that will come as any sort of a surprise to you. But I just want to run through them so that you know the kind of things that, of course, can impact on the stress of an animal. So we just ask you to be a little bit mindful of. So obviously, we've got some photos here of some, let's say, ideal yards. So if your yards don't look like that, you can't be part of MSA. So that's not the case at all. But look, it is just to give you an idea, I suppose, of the kind of things that are important. We don't want any sort of obstructions hanging out. The animals need to be able to walk through freely. So all of those things that I'm quite sure you're very conscious of. One of the things, though, that we do concentrate on quite a bit, and this is not only important here, but also important at the abattoirs, is the loading and unloading process. Because obviously, at that time, not only is it, a fairly stressful period for them anyway, because they're either, getting on or off of the truck, and maybe both of those experiences they haven't enjoyed all that much. But it's just really important that everything can be done to keep animals moving as much as they can at that point. Because of course when they're moving, well then hopefully there's no need for the use of prodders or dogs. So I think, when you read through there, we certainly make a recommendation that if you don't need to use prodders and you don't need to use dogs, then don't. But look, there's also work there to be said that if if dogs are part of your farming practice and the animals are used to them, well then, they might not be all that stressed by them anyway. But that's sort of all outlined there in a bit more detail. We actually find, to be honest, that this can be one of the first problems that we might come across at the processing end of things. Sometimes their ramps may not be what they should be, and look, it's just something that we talk to them about. We try and give them some suggestions if we can, but it's just all about keeping those animals moving whilst they're either going on or off the truck, so that there doesn't need to be any assistance given, if you like. Now, all of these things, again, just recommendations. So if your ramps don't look exactly like that, it's certainly not going to exclude you from it, but it's just, I suppose, to get you thinking about some of those things that can impact on the stress levels of the animal. Because remember, all of those things that are stressing an animal, it's just depleting that glycogen bucket. So some of these things now, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, if you like, of some fairly strong recommendations and also a couple of requirements if you want to be part of it. So we make a recommendation that within the last 14 days, if you don't need to mix your mobs of sheep or even draft them within that last 14 days, that would certainly be worthwhile. And look, the reason for that, I suppose, is that it's been found that in that last 14 days, that gives the animals time to sort themselves out, if you like. There's no more trying to figure out who's boss and that whole socialisation thing that, of course, what all of that does, that kind of behaviour, is stresses the animal. So just in that last 14 days, if you can have them in the mob that you're going to send into slaughter and can leave them, that would be great. Now, if you can't, well then that's understandable. But if you can, there is real benefit in it. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. Now, the maximum time in transit that we allow is 24 hours. So, hopefully that will be enough time for you to get them where they need to go, but that's a bit of a non-negotiable. They can't spend any longer than 24 hours in transit. Gets us to the next point, which is a requirement of the system. So they need to be processed within 48 hours of coming off feed. Now, they work that out at the abattoir from the vendor deck, and I will run through what you need to complete on the vendor deck. Yes, mate?
That would knock out most sale yards, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it is. Look, it is. To be honest, it's actually a little bit easier for sheep MSA through sale yards than it is for cattle. So sheep, they have the 48 hours. Cattle, they only have 36. With sheep, you can actually mix sale mobs together once they've been sold. So if one big customer comes along, buys them all, they can all be mixed in together to go off to the works. With cattle, they can't be mixed at all. So, if they've bought a mob of 2 and a mob of 3 and a mob of 6, they need to be separated on the truck. It's not easy for sale yards, but I must say that sort of further south, so quite a bit further south, Victoria and Tassie, there are, and in southern New South Wales as well, there are about 3 yards that are selling MSA sheep. Are they close to the works? They sure are. So what they do is they sell them first, and then as they're sold, they're on the truck out and to the works that day. So that 48 hours, that's one of the few requirements of this program. So everyone that's involved in the chain will be aware of that. So the agents should be, the processors definitely will be, and I'll show you where they'll be getting their 48-hour information from. So look, obviously it's important to fill out your vendor deck correctly now. This just, I suppose, adds another little bit of importance. Yes?
Does that include curfew?
So it's the time off feed. So
I mean the transit hours. So if there's 6 hours in the yards, do you start 24 hours from when they get on the truck, or from when they start their curfew?
Yeah, from when they get on the truck.
Right.
Yeah, the 24 hours. Yeah. Now, as far as sick or injured animals, the reason that I suppose we talk about these in MSA is again to do with glycogen. So look, if an animal's been sick or injured, that will also be using up its glycogen reserves, and it'll be using up those glycogen reserves simply to keep itself going, not to do anything worthwhile like build muscle. So there's actually, I think, so many things in place now as far as controlling you with what you can do with sick or injured animals. What I would say from an MSA point of view, please don't include them in that consignment because of that impact that sickness would have had on their glycogen levels, the chance of them cutting dark would be really, really high. So I can't offer you any suggestions as to where to send them instead, but we would ask that you wouldn't include them in MSA consignments. Now, just a couple of other things here, and these again are recommendations. So this is just an example of the kind of wool cover that we would ask that the animals have. So it works out to be about 2 weeks of shears. So again, a recommendation, and that's just about, I suppose, protecting or giving the animal a bit of protection against the elements in case we get like a little bit of a cold snap like we've had today. So again, a recommendation that's certainly worthwhile considering. The next one is a requirement. Now the producer must be MSA registered. We can sort that out today. That shouldn't be too difficult. I will say though that if you've got any mates that weren't here today and they say, well, you know, how did you get registered? And you say, well, that fella came and he gave me the form. Actually direct them to the MSA website, because as you'll see, there's just a few things that you need to know. If we just send out the form, well then they don't really have any idea of what they need to do. So if you can just direct them to the MSA website, there's a bit of reading they'll have to do. They might want to get a beer, put an hour aside. There's reading they've got to do, and then there's like a 15-question exam at the end of it. Everything they need to know is in that first bit of reading, but yeah, read it first, because the exam bit can be a little bit frustrating. It's one of those that tells you, you got 3 answers wrong, start again. So that can be really, really frustrating after about an hour or so. But if you read the questions, it's certainly easy enough to do. This part here, question 7 on the NVD. When you are given your MSA registration number, write it in your little green book or red book or whatever it is you keep with you, because you will need to quote that on any NVD that you send in with an MSA eligible mob. Now, it needs to go into question 7. It can't go anywhere else. And if it doesn't go in question 7, that is one surefire way of that mob not being MSA eligible. Is that a bit petty? Probably. But it has to go somewhere, and it has to go somewhere where it can be easily recognised. We'll show you, and I can see you probably all ticking through it in your head going, geez, question 7's getting pretty crowded, and it really is. So I'll run you through the NVD requirements, but if you remember nothing else about today, remember question 7, because we have had mobs of 300 and 400 lambs arrive at a plant. They don't have that written on there. The plant can't fill it in. And if you can't get a new one in there in time, unfortunately that will be the end of the MSA eligibility for that mob. It's, yes ma'am?
You don't seem to get any more for your sheep, for your lambs.
For MSA? Yeah, so that I suppose goes back to what we were talking about right at the start. So there certainly are some premiums emerging through a couple of the, through one of the supermarkets in particular. What I would say is that I think the MSA side of things for sheep is where the cattle were probably about maybe 10 years ago. That if you're not part of it, you are probably just excluding yourself from some markets. So if you were looking to sell to any of the major supermarkets now, they won't buy off you if you're not MSA registered. And moving forward, I think that will probably become even more widespread. So yes, look, there certainly might not be a premium. I think, you know, we hear 10, 20 cents here and there, but not all the time. I think the most important thing about it now is just not excluding yourself from those markets completely by not having a registration. Just at the minute, I think that would be the best reason for doing it. And look, this last one here, there's a recommendation of separate pens for different age categories. I don't think we have anyone that's doing that. And again, that's got just a little bit to do with, you know, reducing the amount of stress in case the bigger ones might be trying to show their authority over the smaller animals. It's a recommendation. Again, we certainly don't have too many producers that are doing it. So if you're unable to do that, I don't think it will impact your results. This one here is an interesting slide for this room of people, and you might be interested to hear about it, so I'll go over it quickly. So when this program first started, it came off the back of the sheep meat eating quality program, and there was some work done in that showed that merinos stressed a little more than other breeds. So of course, I think what was put together is that, well, we talk a lot, and I have today, about animals stressing and the impact that that can have. So of course, if an animal stresses more, well then its likelihood of cutting dark could actually be greater. So having said that, the MSA sheep meat program is probably only 2 years old, really. Now in the real world, this hasn't emerged as a problem. So there's actually a new set of standards that have been written but not approved, and this mention of merino will be removed because it just hasn't actually eventuated as an issue. At the moment, so if any of you have any merino content in there, that needs to be declared on the NVD, just first cross, second cross, whatever that merino input was. And what they do at the works is they just keep a closer eye on that mob to see that there's no problem with pH levels or dark cutting. Now, if you see my ugly mug in about 6 months' time and I'm giving this same presentation, this won't be mentioned because it has actually been removed from the standards. Because they haven't been approved though, I just need to talk about it just for the next couple of months. I spoke about this just a little bit earlier too, about some recommendations as far as nutrition goes. So in that last 30 days, this is I suppose the recommended kind of growth that you'd be looking for. So 100 grams a day for pretty much anything other than merinos, and then 150 days for merino. And look, I think you've probably figured it out, that extra nutrition for the merinos is simply because the thought was that they'd be stressing more, so they would need more to top that bucket up. This will change too. So I think the recommendation will be 100 grams a day. And look, I don't think I've ever done a presentation where that 100 grams a day has been seen as not achievable. Most people seem to be doing more. Again, if you're thinking, God, I don't know how to measure it, and I'm not sure whether mine do. It is a recommendation, and it gives you, I suppose, just something to work on. If they're not meeting that, certainly if they're not growing at all in that last 30 days, well, that probably wouldn't be ideal. But again, it's just a recommendation there to give you some idea of what you should be trying to achieve just in that lead up to slaughter. And all about filling in that glycogen bucket. Now these are the MSA carcass specifications. Now I think it may be on the back of your booklets there, but if they're not, they are in the booklet somewhere. What I would say though is what you will find, this will be the basic spec. Now for any of you that have had anything to do with MSA for cattle, you will know that yes, we have some basic MSA specifications, but then the companies will also put specifications on top of that. And that simply is because their customers will be looking for different things. We often get asked, well, wouldn't it be easier if every processor had the same MSA specs? And yeah, look, it certainly would be. But what that would mean is that there's only one customer out there. And we probably don't want that either. So my point here is that like all grids that you try to meet, and really that's what MSA is, simply another market, just be really sure that you know what their specs are. So even though these are the minimum MSA specifications, when you send them into a works, any works, and maybe when the prime Dorper lamb brand comes up, you might find that their specs look a little different to that. That would certainly be the minimum requirements though. So like anything, just be sure of your spec before you send them in, that would be the minimum requirements. Most of them that are out there at the moment take a much heavier, or not a much heavier animal, but sort of up into the, the 20, 24, 22 kilo bracket. So just to give you some indication. But check with your processor or your brand to see what their requirements are. Because the thing will be, and this is something that we find in the cattle side of things too. There might come a time when your animals will be MSA compliant, but they might not have actually met the company specs for MSA. So yes, they met all those MSA specifications, but if there is to be any premium, you will need to meet the company specifications as well. So please, I can't stress that enough. I won't spend too much time on the processor side of things because I've pretty much used up my time, but just to let you know what the things that are important at the processing side of things. So there's really two things that they need to get very, very right at the processor, and that is if they're using an electrical stimulator on the slaughter floor, they need to make sure that they have the settings on that right and that they have their chiller settings right, because I don't know whether I have a slide that shows it. When we talk about measuring the pH level on an animal, the animal needs to fall below a pH level of 6 between a temperature range of 15 and 35 degrees for its eating quality to be ideal. Now, that is actually as hard to do as what it sounds like. Because, that pH level, yes, will continually keep dropping, and of course, so will the temperature, but it actually needs to happen between a particular range. So what we ask the processors to do is to do a series of pH declines on mobs of sheep and lambs that are going through, so that we know that they are falling, that the pH level's not only falling to where it needs to be, but through that prescribed temperature range. So as you can imagine, if they give them too much electrical stimulation on the slaughter floor, they can heat the carcass up. So they go through then a phenomenon called heat shortening, where the pH level drops, but it drops down not fast enough. So that meat, whilst you could eat it, is not great. It might be a little bit like eating this man's hat here. If it goes the other way though, and the chillers are too cold and they're not getting enough electrical stimulation, well then they go through a phenomenon called cold shortening. That would be like eating that table. So both of those things, whilst not ideal, heat shorten is probably the better of the two evils there. So there's quite a lot of responsibility, if you like, falls onto the processor. And we monitor this quite carefully. Even though these pH declines aren't done by MSA staff, we actually ask that they be sent into the MSA office and regularly, so that we can be not only sure that they're doing them, but that the results are where they need to be. So there's quite a lot of focus on the processor in this, as you would expect. And just quick, you're all familiar with the stimulator that I'm talking about? So there's a couple of ways that they do it, but I just wanted to explain to you the reason that they do it is that it actually speeds up that process of glycolysis, which is the glycogen turning to lactic acid. So if they don't use some sort of electrical stimulation, that process takes about 20 hours. If they use some stimulation on them, it gets that down to about 8 hours. So of course what that means is that it will fall through the window overnight. And as you can imagine or probably know, chiller space is always at a premium. So that means they've fallen to the pH level that they need to be overnight so that they can go out, so that the ones that are being killed today can come into the chiller. So these stimulators, there's a couple of different ways. This one here, these beams here are actually electrified. So as the carcass moves along, they'll just be receiving it's not a substantial jolt. You certainly wouldn't want to put your hand on it, but they'll just be a series of jolts as the carcasses move along. Now, when a processor comes on board, we go out and I don't, we have guys who know what they're doing, go out and check on the processors to make sure that everything's as it should be. One of the things we found at one of the first plants that we went to is that, as you may or may not know, at a sheep works, the chain stops a lot so that they can deal with retains, and so the chain is constantly stopping. Unfortunately, the stimulator wasn't. So if you were this unlucky little lamb here, well, that poor little fellow was nearly a kebab by the time he got to the other end of the floor. So it's just things like that we go and do an audit before we start, just to know that those things are in place. And look, that just explains that. So again, that's another example of the stimulator. They're not, to be honest, all as flash as that. Some of them have like a device that looks not dissimilar to this microphone that they will insert into the carcass to give the stimulation. It just depends a little bit on the size and the throughput of the plant. They both work, and in fact they both have that same disadvantage. You need to make sure that you're giving them the right amount, and we can certainly help with that. Just to give you an idea, I suppose, of the size of the MSA program. As you can see, it hasn't been going for a lot of years for sheep. So last year there were 5.7 million animals presented for slaughter as MSA. So at the moment, not all of those are being packed as MSA. So even though they were presented as MSA eligible, they weren't actually packed into a brand that has the MSA logo on it. So what we're thinking is that that number there probably won't change too much, but the amount of animals that are actually packed and labelled as MSA will increase. And I think as more brands come online and as some of the more of the supermarkets come online, that whilst that figure might not change all that much, the amount that are actually packed as MSA certainly will. All right, now I leave this bit to the end because these are the bits that you've really got to remember. So you're registered and you're ready to go with MSA. You've got some animals there that you're pretty happy with how they've been fed. You've got demand for it because we've got the prime Dorper lamb brand set up, so you're all ready to send them in. You don't need a separate national vendor declaration. The only reason I say that, if it had anything to do with the cattle one, there is actually a separate vendor deck. There's not with the sheep. But there are some things that you have to do. So the first and foremost, number 7. This is where the MSA registration number needs to go in. Now, as question number 7 has kind of become the go-to question, you might find that that's pretty well chock-a-block. Please just write it wherever you can around question 7 here. Anywhere in there is fine, anywhere over here is not, and it not being on there at all is certainly not fine either. So question 7 is an important one. At the moment, if you have any merino content in your animals, it just would need to be described there. So it's either full, first cross, second cross, whatever it might be. All that will mean is that at the moment they will keep a closer eye on that mob at the processor to make sure that there's no problem with pH or dark cutting. In, as I said, about 6 months, that'll be gone. So we need to talk about it now, but not for too much longer. These two here become really important. So the time of dispatch and then the hours off feed, that's where they work the 48 hours off of. So this time of dispatch minus the hours off feed plus 48 hours is the time that they need to be slaughtered by. So they're going to be two really important columns to the processor. So at the moment, if you have trouble with your trucking, filling that in, my recommendation would be fill the time in for him or her and then get them to sign it, because they still need to sign it, but it does need to be completed. So look, they're the really important points with the vendor deck. Question 7, the time of dispatch and the time off feed, and the fact that you just use your normal national vendor deck. And look, one of the reasons that can be so important is when you write your MSA registration number up there, that might actually be the first time that the processor knows that you want them to be processed as MSA. So, you know, it really is an important one. Whilst it might seem a really simple point, which it is, it's an important one as well. Registration process. As I said, that's going to be easy for you guys. You have the form there. Fill it in at your leisure. And if you have all the info there today, I can fill it in and take it back and get it in the system. It will probably take about 5 or 10 days before you get your registration pack. Look, the most important part of that, of course, will be your certificate that has your MSA registration number on there, but you will also receive a pack of information that, again, sort of summarises the really important bits. For those of you that have mates that couldn't come along today, direct them to the MSA website, because, as I said, there's just a bit that you need to know. If we just send the form out to them and they haven't sort of sat through something like this, it's going to be difficult for them to know what they need to do. But again, warn them, they might want to put an hour aside. And if they can do it at beer o'clock, that might help too. So look, just to go over, I suppose, the important bits, I'll just get them all up here. So really, in summary, I think we probably haven't digressed too far from where we started, and that is that it is all about the importance of an animal being fed well and treated well. The one thing that I haven't touched on at all though is the availability of water. So there's a recommendation in MSA that animals have water available to them at all times other than during transport. What I would say though is that that's something that you might want to have a little discussion with your truckie about as well. Because, you know, if you put them on full of water, whilst that's great for eating quality because the animal's not going to be dehydrated, it might not be ideal for that animal's journey or the transport company. So just know that we make that recommendation from an eating quality perspective, because a dehydrated carcass it'll shrink, so it might have a slight impact on your hot standard carcass weight, but a really dehydrated carcass will also cut dark. So just know that water availability is an MSA requirement for eating quality only. Please don't ignore then though the requirements of your transport company, because it's no good you getting them to the point that they have to be, and then your transport company doesn't have a particularly great experience, and then you have an issue the next time you try and get any off the farm. So it's one that is probably stated a lot more black and white than that in the books, but I think it was something that I actually had brought to my attention by the owner of a transport company. And he said, you know, mate, you can't just keep going out there telling these people to, you know, put their animals on our truck full of water. So it's something that I do sort of stress now, and just have that conversation with your transport operator, because I think it's certainly a worthwhile one. You guys can all be registered by the end of the day. Now, the thing might be is that you might keep this little bit of paper in your back pocket for months now and not do anything with it. You might not have to change anything that you do in the way that you rear or treat your animals. And if that's the case, that's great, because what that means is that when the time comes that your agent says or your society says, hey, look, you know, we're ready to go with whatever, are you MSA registered? You can answer a resounding yes to that. And then the only things you'll need to be sure of is that you've filled your vendor deck out correctly, and that you can get them in there and slaughtered in that 48-hour time period off feed. So, look, thank you for your attention. I've not too bad over time, I don't think. I'd be happy to answer questions now, or look, I'll be around at lunchtime if you wanted to ask them one-on-one. So thank you.